The chamber buzzed with the low hum of restless voices, the kind of tension that crackled like static before a storm. Then Andy Biggs leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk that seemed rehearsed for the cameras. His voice cut through the air, sharp and dripping with disdain. "Congresswoman," he sneered, "perhaps this conversation is too complex for you to follow." The words landed like a slap, echoing against the marble walls. A silence spread, swift and heavy. You could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle intake of breath from those seated behind the mahogany desks. Some leaned back, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, hungry for the fallout. The camera zoomed in tight on Biggs' face, capturing the smirk he couldn't quite hide, the glint of arrogance in his eyes. It wasn't just a question. It was a provocation. An insult meant not only for Crockett, but for everyone watching who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat still. Her eyes narrowed, her posture unshaken. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold. Instead, she let the insult hang in the air, stretching the silence into something unbearable. Even Biggs shifted slightly in his chair, suddenly aware of just how quiet the room had become. Viewers watching at home leaned closer to their screens. Was she going to let it slide? Would she bite back with fury? Every second felt longer than the last. The chamber, once restless, was now holding its breath. Because everyone in that room and everyone glued to the broadcast knew what was at stake. Biggs hadn't just challenged Crockett. He had dismissed the very idea that she could stand toe-to-toe with him, that she had the intellect, the authority, the fire to dismantle him. And Jasmine Crockett was about to show him, and the entire country, just how wrong he was. The sting of Andy Biggs' insult didn't just live in that chamber. It tapped into something deeper, a wound stitched across the fabric of America. This wasn't just one man sneering at a colleague. It was a familiar echo, the same tired playbook used for generations. Belittle, undermine, dismiss. And this time, 'twas aimed at a black woman who had carved her way into one of the most powerful halls in the country. The cameras caught everything. The smug tilt of Biggs' chin, the way he seemed to savor the jab. But what those same cameras also caught was the electricity building in the room. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, sensing the stakes rising. Viewers online, already primed for conflict, clipped the moment instantly, sharing it with captions like, "Did he really just say that?" Why did it matter so much? Because Biggs hadn't simply questioned intelligence. He had questioned belonging. He had attempted to reduce Crockett to a caricature, the outsider, the unqualified, the undeserving. And yet, that's precisely why his words set the stage for something far bigger than a heated exchange. For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone who had ever been told you're not smart enough. This wasn't just political theater. It was a mirror. Crockett, sitting calm and silent in those first moments, wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying every person who had ever been underestimated because of the color of their skin, their gender, their accent, their roots. And on the other side stood Andy Biggs, a man who wielded arrogance as armor, who thrived on condescension. His insult wasn't just meant to silence. It was meant to remind everyone of the old order, the way things used to be when voices like Crockett's weren't allowed to rise in the first place. But what the audience at home didn't know, what they couldn't possibly predict, was how swiftly this moment would flip. Crockett wasn't about to play defense. She wasn't going to beg for recognition or prove herself with statistics and policy jargon. No, she had something sharper, something Biggs could never anticipate. The chamber sat in the hush of anticipation. On social media, the clip had already begun to spread, even before her reply had come. People were typing furiously, bracing for the clapback, because they knew, deep down, that the calm before the storm is always the most dangerous part. And when Crockett finally opened her mouth, it wasn't just an answer. It was a rebuke that turned an insult into a moment of history. But to understand why her words hit so hard, we need to pull back the curtain to see the history between arrogance and resilience, to see the clash that had been building long before this exchange. Because when the past is laid bare, Crockett's response doesn't just sting, it devastates. Andy Biggs has never been known for restraint. His career has been defined not by quiet leadership, but by loud interruptions, red-faced speeches, and a constant need to assert dominance in the room. Time and again, he's wielded insults as weapons, mistaking volume for authority and sneers for intellect. Late-night comedians have mocked his rants, splicing clips of him fumbling through sound bites into viral montages. Opponents in debates have exposed his contradictions with little more than a raised eyebrow. And each time, Biggs has lashed back with fury, proving what many already knew: beneath the bluster lies a fragile ego, too thin-skinned to endure even the mildest critique. This pattern is no accident. Biggs thrives on performance. He craves the clash, not for policy or principle, but for the rush of dominance, the fleeting satisfaction of putting someone, in their place. And when his target is a woman or a person of color, his arrogance sharpens, revealing a deeper insecurity. Because nothing rattles him more than voices he cannot control, perspectives he cannot diminish. Take his past exchanges in Congress. Time after time, Biggs has turned procedural debates into personal attacks, shifting focus away from substance and onto spectacle. He knows that soundbites travel faster than policy papers, and so he crafts his barbs for maximum sting. Yet in doing so, he reveals the weakness he tries so desperately to hide. He cannot stand toe-to-toe with dignity, so he swings wildly with disdain. And that fragility has followed him beyond the halls of power. Critics on social media have labeled him the king of overcompensation. Memes mock his outbursts, contrasting his fiery insults with calm, devastating rebuttals from his opponents. To many, he has become less a serious statesman and more a caricature of arrogance, a man who mistakes disrespect for strength. It is this reputation that framed the moment with Jasmine Crockett. When Biggs leaned forward with that smirk, it wasn't born of confidence. It was born of fear. Fear that Crockett, articulate and unshaken, would expose him. Fear that his bluster would crumble against her clarity. Fear that his fragile ego would once again be punctured in front of a national audience. So he struck first, hurling an insult he hoped would destabilize her. But in doing so, he revealed more about himself than he ever intended. The smirk, the sneer, the dig at her intelligence. It wasn't power. It was panic, because Andy Biggs knows what history has shown him time and again. Arrogance always collapses under the weight of truth. And Jasmine Crockett was the truth he could not silence. But if Biggs was the fragile glass, Crockett was the hammer about to swing. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch when Andy Biggs questioned her intelligence, you have to know where she comes from. Because Crockett's strength wasn't built in the polished corridors of Congress. It was forged in places where dignity was constantly tested, where her voice had to cut through noise just to be heard. Long before she took her seat in the House. Crockett was a public defender in Texas. Her clients were the forgotten, the underestimated, the ones who couldn't afford an army of lawyers or the privilege of connections. Day after day, she walked into courtrooms where her very presence challenged expectations. A young, black woman standing tall against prosecutors and judges who often doubted her before she even spoke. She learned quickly that confidence wasn't optional. It was survival. Every sharp question, every raised eyebrow, every patronizing chuckle from across the courtroom became fuel. And with every case she fought, Crockett built not just a reputation, but a resilience. She didn't just win arguments. She won respect. Respect she had to wrestle from a system that wasn't built for her success. Asterisk, that fire followed her into politics. When she stepped onto the national stage, critics dismissed her as too blunt, too unapologetic, too unwilling to play the genteel games of Washington. But Crockett didn't come to Washington to play. She came to fight for those who rarely saw themselves represented, the working families, the immigrants. The overlooked communities whose voices had been drowned out by the powerful asterisk. And perhaps that is what unnerves men like Andy Biggs the most. Crockett doesn't apologize for existing in spaces where others have told her she doesn't belong. She doesn't dilute her tone to make arrogance comfortable. She speaks with the clarity of someone who has nothing to prove because her record, her work, and her lived experience are proof enough. Asterisk for Crockett, insults about her intelligence aren't new. They're recycled lines, echoes of a prejudice she's faced since childhood. Teachers doubting her aptitude. Classmates questioning her place. Colleagues underestimating her ability. Each time, she responded not with silence, but with achievement. Every degree earned, every client defended. Every election won. All of it was her rebuttal. Asterisk, so when Biggs lobbed his insult, Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to match his sneer. She had decades of experience, turning arrogance into kindling and lighting it aflame with the spark of truth. And perhaps most importantly, Crockett knows what it feels like to have family, identity, and belonging questioned the same way countless Americans do. She carries their stories with her, the struggles of those who came before, the sacrifices of those who gave her the opportunity to stand where she stands now. That's why she doesn't break under pressure. She becomes sharper, more focused, more dangerous to those who underestimate her. Asterisk, on that day in the chamber, Crockett's composure wasn't just strategy. It was history. It was the weight of every courtroom battle, every campaign trail insult. Every moment she'd been told you can't. Biggs may have thought he was playing a simple game of dominance. But Crockett was playing for something far bigger. Dignity, justice, and the validation of millions watching who knew exactly what it felt like to be dismissed. Asterisk. And that is why the moment to come landed with such devastating force. Crockett wasn't just ready for Biggs. She had been preparing for him her entire life. Asterisk. And when the two finally collided on live TV, the results left jaws on the floor. The chamber pulsed with unease. Andy Biggs had thrown his jab, and now he leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the smug grin of a man convinced he'd won before the fight even began. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't so much as blink. Her stillness was unnerving, like the calm eye of a storm that everyone knew was about to unleash. Asterisk. Biggs wasn't patient. He pressed on, his voice rising, filling the air with interruptions. "See, this is exactly the problem," he barked, gesturing wildly as though volume alone could validate his argument. He pointed, waved, sneered, the theater of arrogance in full swing. Cameras darted back and forth, catching his red face. The glint of condescension in his eyes. The tightening of his jaw each time Crockett didn't take the bait. Asterisk. And yet, Crockett remained poised. Hands folded, gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Every second she refused to rise to his fury was a second that made his theatrics look smaller, weaker, more desperate. Some in the chamber stifled laughs behind their hands. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The audience at home could feel it too, the imbalance of power shifting, slowly but unmistakably. Asterisk. Then it happened. Biggs cut her off mid-sentence, voice booming. Do you even understand what's being discussed here? The words echoed like a schoolyard taunt, and for the briefest moment, there was silence. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as though studying him under a microscope, as though deciding whether his question was even worth her breath. The hush stretched. The tension grew unbearable. Asterisk, and then came the sound, gasps from one side, laughter from the other. The chamber was split. Some were appalled by his disrespect. Others leaned in, anticipating the clash. The energy surged, rising like a wave, waiting to crash. Asterisk Crockett finally leaned forward. Her lips parted, but her voice was measured, calm, sharp as a blade honed on years of battles. She began not with fury, but with precision. She didn't shout. She didn't match his theatrics. Instead, she spoke in the kind of tone that makes an audience lean closer. Afraid to miss a word, asterisk, and that's when it happened. The moment no one could have predicted. The line that would ripple far beyond those walls. The words that would ignite laughter, shock, applause, and outrage all at once. Asterisk, and then came the line that would set the internet on fire. Asterisk, the silence before Jasmine Crockett spoke was so sharp it felt like the entire chamber was holding its breath. Andy Biggs' insults still hung in the air like stale smoke. Do you even understand what's being discussed here? He leaned back in his chair, smug, waiting for her to fumble, to flinch. To prove his caricature true. Asterisk, but Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she let the silence stretch until his smirk began to falter. And then, with the calmness of someone who knew the truth was entirely on her side, she spoke. Asterisk, Congressman, she began. Her voice deliberate, her tone layered with both dignity and fire. I don't just understand what's being discussed. I live it every day. While you sit here and sneer, families in my district are struggling with the consequences of the very policies you champion. So when you question my intelligence, understand this: you're not insulting me. You're insulting the people I represent. And that's something I will never let stand. Asterisk, the room erupted with a low murmur. Staffers shifted in their seats, reporters' pens flew across notepads. And cameras zoomed in on Biggs' face as the confident smirk drained to unease. Crockett didn't pause to let him recover. She pressed forward, her words hitting like a gavel. Asterisk. You want to talk about intelligence? She continued, eyes locked on him, unwavering. Intelligence is knowing the difference between talking points that rile up a base and policies that actually make Americans' lives better. Intelligence is recognizing that empathy isn't weakness, it's strength. Intelligence is understanding that public service means service to the public, not to special interests, not to ego, and certainly not to prejudice. Asterisk, a sharp gasp rippled across the chamber. Crockett's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a scalpel, cutting away the layers of Biggs' bravado to reveal the hollowness beneath. Asterisk. Biggs opened his mouth to interject, but Crockett was ready. She raised her hand slightly, not in anger, but with the commanding composure of a woman who knew she had the floor and the moment. No, Congressman. You had your turn. Now it's mine. Asterisk. The crowd hushed again. Cameras captured the fire in her eyes, the steadiness in her voice, the sheer control she wielded. Asterisk. You questioned whether I understand, she said. Leaning in, her voice lowering to that dangerous quiet that forces everyone to listen harder. Well, let me make something perfectly clear. I understand what it means to come from nothing and still stand here today. I understand what it means to walk into rooms where people look at you and decide, before you've spoken a word, that you don't belong. I understand what it means to have to be twice as prepared, twice as polished, and twice as unflinching just to be seen as equal. Asterisk. Every word carried the weight of generations, of history, of unspoken truths that the chamber rarely allowed to surface. Biggs shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his allies for support that wasn't coming. Asterisk, and here's what else I understand, Crockett continued, her cadence rising, her voice now commanding the room. I understand that cheap insults may win you applause from the loudest corners of the internet. But they don't solve the crises our people are living through. They don't put food on the table. They don't keep families in their homes. They don't keep our children safe in schools. And they certainly don't move this country forward. The murmurs swelled into something louder, half applause, half incredulous laughter at the sheer boldness of her takedown. Social media timelines lit up instantly. Hashtags began to form, clips began to spread. Viewers at home sat straighter, some with tears in their eyes, others with fists clenched in solidarity. Asterisk Crockett wasn't done. She paused, letting the audience both in the room and across the country sit with her words. Then she delivered the final strike, sharp, unforgettable, impossible to spin. Asterisk, so the next time you feel the urge to question my intelligence. Congressman, she said, voice steady as stone. Remember this. Intelligence isn't proven by who shouts the loudest. It's proven by who stands the strongest. And on that measure, sir, I leave it to the people watching to decide who's really failing this chamber. Asterisk. Gasps, laughter, applause that echoed off the chamber walls. Even some on Biggs' side couldn't hide their shock. Biggs himself sat frozen, the flush in his face betraying the collapse of his composure. His earlier swagger had dissolved into silence. Asterisk Crockett leaned back, calm once more, her job done. The chamber, however, was anything but calm. Reporters whispered furiously, phones buzzed with alerts. And every camera angle was already being clipped and shared to millions online. The moment was cemented. The insult meant to humiliate her had transformed into a mic drop heard across the nation. Asterisk, and yet, even as the applause died down and the chamber scrambled to regain order, one thought lingered like thunder on the horizon. This wasn't the end of the story. Because what happened after that exchange, the ripple effect, the viral storm, the national conversation would shake the political landscape far beyond those walls. Asterisk. What unfolded next would leave even Crockett's allies stunned. Asterisk. The chamber had barely settled before the aftershocks began rippling outward. Jasmine Crockett's words were still echoing in the rafters when the first phones lit up with push notifications. Clips of the exchange flew onto Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube in real time. Within minutes, hashtags like hashtag Crockett clapback and hashtag mic drop moment were trending nationwide. Asterisk reporters, who just moments earlier had been quietly scribbling notes, now typed furiously, their faces lit by the glow of their screens. Political journalists whispered to each other, "Did you hear that? Did you see Biggs' face?" Camera crews replayed the footage, looping Crockett's takedown over and over again. The smirk melting off Biggs' face was already on its way to becoming the meme of the week. Asterisk across the country. Living rooms and offices buzzed with reactions. Supporters of Crockett leaped to their feet, applauding even though she couldn't hear them. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of composure under fire. Immigrant families sent it to one another in group chats, attaching words like "that's us." And she said, "what we always feel." On social media, celebrities joined in. A famous comedian tweeted, "Crockett didn't just answer Biggs, she obliterated him." That's how you handle a bully. A Grammy-winning singer posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "This is what dignity sounds like. More of this energy, please." Even politicians who normally stayed silent about congressional drama couldn't resist weighing in. A senator wrote, "This is why representation matters." Crockett spoke truth to power. Asterisk, meanwhile, Andy Biggs and his allies scrambled. His staff rushed to draft statements, trying to spin the moment as partisan theatrics, but the internet wasn't buying it. Side-by-side edits showed Crockett's measured composure against Big's sneer, contrasting her dignity with his arrogance. The narrative was set, and it was one he couldn't escape. Cable news networks broke into regular programming to replay the clip. Pundits dissected every second, frame by frame. One analyst said, "This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a cultural moment." Crockett turned an insult into a universal rallying cry. Another added, "In politics, perception is everything." And right now, Crockett is being perceived as the voice of the people. By nightfall. The exchange had gone international. European and Latin American news outlets translated the clip, framing it as a story of resilience in the face of arrogance. Commentators in immigrant communities around the globe connected with Crockett's words about belonging, about being forced to prove yourself twice over. What began as a sneer in a congressional chamber had grown into a global conversation about dignity, prejudice, and power. In the midst of all this, Crockett herself remained composed. She didn't flood the media with interviews. She didn't boast. Instead, she let the moment breathe, confident that her words spoke for themselves. That restraint only amplified the impact, making the contrast with Big's frantic backpedaling even starker. The ripple effect was undeniable. Activists cited Crockett's words in rallies that weekend. Editorials called her takedown one of the defining political moments of the year. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with jokes about Andy Biggs needing ice for the burn. Even in communities far removed from Washington politics, people repeated Crockett's line, "Intelligence isn't proven by who shouts the loudest. It's proven by who stands the strongest." It became more than a clapback, it became a mantra. A phrase carried on posters, tweets, and protest chants. A reminder that dignity could triumph over mockery, and truth could shatter arrogance. And yet, even with the tidal wave of support, the story wasn't finished. Because beneath the applause and the memes, a deeper question remained unanswered. What lesson would America take from this moment? Would it fade as another viral clip in the endless churn of news? Or would it crystallize into something larger, a turning point in how we measure strength, service, and leadership? The answer to that question, as the nation soon discovered, would reveal itself in the days that followed. Because Crockett's words had not only silenced Andy Biggs, they had awakened something far bigger as the dust began to settle. What lingered wasn't just the sting of Crockett's words, but the undeniable truth they carried. Her response had been more than a personal defense against Andy Biggs' insult. It was a mirror held up to America itself. At its core, the confrontation was never just about one man questioning another's intelligence. It was about who gets to define intelligence, who gets to claim belonging, and whose story is allowed to matter in the American experiment. Crockett reframed the entire attack with a quiet kind of power. By refusing to descend into pettiness, she lifted the moment higher. She turned mockery into clarity, venom into vision. In that chamber, she reminded the country of something it often forgets, that the strength of America doesn't come from sneers or smirks, but from the grit of those who have always been told they don't belong and who rise anyway. Her words resonated because they touched a universal chord. Intelligence isn't about pedigree or privilege. It isn't about who talks the loudest or who carries the biggest microphone. It's about resilience, empathy, and the courage to speak truth in hostile rooms. Crockett embodied that truth, not with rage, but with dignity. And in doing so, she exposed the weakness at the heart of Biggs. Attack that arrogance always crumbles when confronted by authenticity. For immigrants, children of immigrants, and anyone who has ever been underestimated. Crockett's stand was a reminder. You are enough. Your presence is proof. Your story, your struggle, your survival, these are testaments to intelligence that cannot be measured on a sneer. America's greatness has always been written by those who endured doubt, condescension, and prejudice, yet still built something enduring. The chamber had heard Big's voice, sharp and dismissive. But what the country remembered was Crockett's voice, steady, grounded, unshaken. That contrast itself was the moral lesson. Anger burns hot and fast. Dignity endures. The immigrant story is the American story. The story of proving, again and again, that belonging is not granted by the powerful, but earned by the perseverant. Crockett's moment was not a detour from that legacy, but a continuation of it. By standing firm, she reminded millions that dignity is itself a form of resistance, and that no amount of sneering can erase the truth of contribution, sacrifice, and humanity. Even those who might disagree with her politics could not deny the power of the moment. Because beyond partisanship, what people saw was courage. And courage in its purest form is contagious. That is why this moment will not be forgotten once the headlines fade. It will live on in classrooms, in campaign speeches, in whispered encouragement between parents and children. It will remind the underestimated that their silence is not a requirement, that their intelligence doesn't need validation from the loudest voice in the room. And perhaps most importantly, it will serve as a warning to those who traffic in arrogance and mockery, that sooner or later, their words will collapse under the weight of truth. As Crockett left the chamber that day, she carried with her more than just a personal victory. She carried the moral clarity of a timeless lesson. America is strongest not when it mocks, but when it lifts. Not when it divides, but when it unites. Not when it sneers, but when it listens. And that is why this clash, a sneer answered by a sentence, will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. And so, what began as a sneer ended as a lesson. Andy Biggs may have tried to diminish Jasmine Crockett with a single dismissive question. But what he sparked instead was a moment of clarity that cut through the noise of politics. Dignity faced down arrogance. Truth outshone mockery. And intelligence, real intelligence, revealed itself not in the insult, but in the calm, razor-sharp response that followed. That's why this moment matters. It wasn't just about two people in a chamber. It was about the story of America itself, who gets to be heard, who gets to belong, and who has the courage to stand firm in the face of dismissal. Crockett's answer was more than personal. It was universal. And for anyone who has ever been underestimated, doubted, or sneered at, it was a reminder. You are not defined by their contempt. You are defined by your strength. Now. The power of this story doesn't end here. It continues with you. If this moment resonated, if it reminded you of your own battles, or if it reignited your belief in a more dignified, inclusive America, then share it. Pass it on. Add your voice to the millions refusing to let arrogance have the last word. So subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell so you never miss a story like this. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because every time dignity confronts arrogance, truth wins. And together, we can make sure that truth is never silenced. This isn't just a clip. It's a call. A call to remember, to resist, and to rise. And it begins with you.